From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden gives a prime-time speech calling for Congress to pass gun control measures as Senate negotiators look for common ground. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial writer Monet Ukwe-Barua. In the wake of the school mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas, Republicans and Democrats are working to see if there's some kind of legislation that could pass through a 50-50 Senate. And remember, the filibuster requirement is 60 votes there. But President Biden is making clear that he wants more comprehensive legislation. In a televised address on Thursday, he said this is not about taking away anyone's guns. It's not about vilifying gun owners. He added, I respect the culture and tradition and the concerns of lawful gun owners. At the same time, the Second Amendment, like all other rights, is not absolute. And as for what he specifically wants to see happen, listen to this.
I know that we can't prevent every tragedy, but here's what I believe we have to do. Here's what the overwhelming majority of American people believe we must do. Here's what the families in Buffalo and Uvalde in Texas told us we must do. We need to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. And if we can't ban assault weapons, then we should raise the age to purchase them from 18 to 21. Strengthen background checks. Enact safe storage law and red flag laws. Repeal the immunity that protects gun manufacturers from liability. Address the mental health crisis, deepening the trauma of gun violence and as a consequence of that violence.
Well, to start at the top there, he mentioned an assault weapons ban, and he later said that there was one that passed in 1994 and expired. Kim, what do we know about how that ban worked, or if it did?
Yeah, so he not only mentioned that ban, but in comments earlier in the week, he went so far as to claim that when we had passed that assault weapons ban, mass shootings went down. That assertion, unfortunately, per usual, has no real root in fact. If you go back, we did pass this experiment with the ban in 1994. It lasted until 2004 when it expired. That ban barred the sale of 18 different types of rifles and shotguns. The definition of what landed those guns on the list was entirely political because the only thing that really qualified them for the list were cosmetic qualities that made them look more like military-grade weapons. Their stocks, for instance. The banned guns, which, by the way, people who own guns call sporting rifles, not assault weapons, had the exact same caliber and velocity of hundreds of others of rifles that remained legal, which is why, and no surprise, that ban really didn't make any difference to gun crimes. Rifles, which would include what the left calls assault weapons, account for only a really small share of gun crime. They made up about 2% of gun crimes prior to the ban, and they accounted for about 3% in 2004, the year the ban expired. They remained 3% in 2020, something that, really gets overlooked because people are so focused on these buzzwords. The vast majority of U.S. gun murders and non-negligent manslaughters result from handguns, almost 60% of those cases in 2020. And by the way, semi-automatic handguns also remain the firearm that are used most by mass shooters, including, for instance, like the Virginia Tech shooter who used 2 handguns to kill 32 people. So this isn't going to make a difference. I think it's unfortunate that they're calling for it because it, again, takes attention away from the things that we really know are driving this: mental health, school safety, etc. And I would also note, too, that the other reason this ban didn't work is that even when they took these 18 guns off the market, as I said, hundreds of thousands, millions of other rifles that operated exactly the same way were still there. Short of going for an all-out confiscation of rifles in the country, which, by the way, would probably provoke a civil uprising, you're not really doing anything if you're going to have a determined killer, they're going to have plenty of access and means to get a lethal weapon.
Another thing Biden mentioned was this alleged immunity that gun manufacturers have, and he has made this claim before and been called on it by fact checkers. In his address on Thursday, he said they're the only industry in this country that has that kind of immunity. Imagine If the tobacco industry had been immune from being sued, where we'd be today. The gun industry's special protections are outrageous. And I will point to an Associated Press fact check when Biden made similar comments at his State of the Union address. And what it explains is that if you purchase a handgun, a rifle, and there's a defect with it, negligent manufacturing, negligent design, something like that, that hurts you, you, of course, can sue the gun manufacturer like you would any other company. But there was a law passed in 2005 that, reading from the Associated Press, provides legal protections for gun manufacturers from being held liable for injuries caused by criminal misuse of their weapons. And the key word there, Minay, is misuse, because obviously the gun manufacturers are selling a legal product and they don't want anyone to take their product and go out and commit crimes with it. And I come to the analogy I would draw is with other events of mass killings, people driving cars into crowds. And it wouldn't come to my mind, Minay, after an event like that to sue Ford or GM or the manufacturer of the automobile for that use that was obviously not intended by the people making the car.
Right. I think you're right to point to that fact check to point out, first of all, that gun manufacturers aren't completely shielded from lawsuits, as you mentioned, when they do fail in manufacturing their guns in a safe way, and shooters are found to have used the gun in a way that sort of was described by the manufacturer and it didn't function the way that they advertised, they are still liable for that. But the reason that Congress did pass legislation within the past 15 years or so to partially shield gun manufacturers for certain types of civil liability is because of that tendency that you're hinting at, where people who generally dislike gun ownership or who are trying to sort of capitalize in the aftermath of a shooting will bring a lawsuit against a gun manufacturer despite the fact that they didn't really err at all in how they manufactured or advertised the gun. So it's just one avenue where people try to use civil litigation to basically create policy changes that both policymakers and the public are unwilling to sort of impose through the normal avenue, which would be through the law and creating restrictions. I do think that more and more people are thinking about sort of what reasonable restrictions could we make on gun ownership and things like that in the aftermath of these sorts of shootings. But it's very clear that the gun manufacturers are by and large acting within the letter of the law, and that the products that they're creating and marketing are deemed to be legal. And so you have to find another avenue if you're trying to restrict their activities.
Another idea that President Biden mentioned was raising the age to purchase an assault weapon from 18 to 21, and leaving aside for a moment the definitional question of what is an assault weapon. This is something that some states are already moving to do. New York's legislature on Thursday passed a law doing exactly that. In New York, you have to be 21 to possess a handgun. And the new bill would require you to be 21 to buy or possess a semi-automatic rifle. It would still allow 18-year-olds, as I understand it, to buy other kinds of rifles. And it would also impose a licensing requirement for semi-automatic rifles. Kim, what do you make of this, and particularly the constitutional challenge that is likely to come to these kinds of new changes, particularly on the age requirement?
Yeah, I have a real issue with this proposal for a couple of reasons. One is, for every mentally unstable young man who's been marginalized by society and ends up going out to engage in a horrific event like this, there are hundreds or thousands of totally mentally stable, capable 18-year-olds. I have a problem with saying that we are going to allow those men and women to go out and fight and die for their country on a battlefield, but that we don't trust them to have a gun. By the way, also at an age when they're just leaving home, they may be taking a first job, they may be moving to a neighborhood that isn't as safe because since they are in a first job, they're not earning as much money, and that you're going to tell them that even though they may be fully competent, capable, we classify them an adult in every other way, that they're not allowed any form of self-protection if this is something that they so want. So, I do appreciate that there is this terrible pattern emerging of 18-year-old, 19-year-old men. I do think that this is something we really need to look at in terms of their ability to so easily access firearms. Maybe we need to have a far more complete and thorough background check for younger aged gun buyers, ones that involve, I don't know, checking with their schools to see if their fellow students had said that, they'd been referred to the office because they had talked about shooting up people. We know now that there have been just so many flags with so many of these shooters that have been ignored. So we have to have a better system for that. I do think that there's potentially constitutional issues to that. Also, just to a quote, assault weapons ban. Remember that when the 1994 law expired in 2004, we didn't yet have the 2008 Heller decision, which reaffirmed the individual right to bear arms, especially those that are in common use. I think there's a huge question about whether much of this would be constitutional under that ruling.
Well, I agree with that, but I'm curious to see how these cases would play out. And I think the argument that we allow young people to join the Marines at 18 and go fight and die in this country's wars is a powerful one. On the other hand, we still have a national 21 drinking age. And apparently there is a state, Mississippi, where the age of majority is still 21 years old. And this shift to 18, as I understand it, was something that came about largely amid the change of the voting age to 18. And so it's not clear to me which way the Supreme Court would come down on that. And I think that's also true for these other requirements, a licensing requirement, for example. And so, Renee, I think there's still a lot of room for states to experiment under the Second Amendment. I think there's a wide view that states can't do anything to address these issues, but the Supreme Court has held that there is a fundamental individual right to arms ownership for the purpose of self-defense. And we are still waiting for a lot of these court cases to play out about how much states can burden that right with licensing requirements and so forth. There's a case pending at the Supreme Court right now about New York's concealed carry permit laws. And so I think there's a lot of room, Monet, for these states to experiment, and some of these laws might get struck down and some of them might not, but we will get to learn the real contours of where the Supreme Court wants to draw the lines on the Second Amendment.
Right. I do think that one helpful way to think about where the law regarding restrictions on gun ownership might shake out as more states experiment is that probably the outright bans on certain types of guns are going to be a non-starter for the reasons that Kim mentioned. We've already tried it and found that it was a highly irrational policy that ended up doing very little to actually sort of prevent dangerous weapons from getting in the hands of the wrong people. And that's also a highly unpopular approach because some of the weapons deemed to be assault rifles, quote unquote, are among the most popularly owned guns in the country, and that includes the AR-15, of course. I also think it probably would be a non-starter to take the New York State approach of saying that people under a certain age are outright unable to buy a certain type of gun, and that applies both to semi-automatic weapons as a whole and specifically to handguns in New York State now. I don't know where the Supreme Court would come down on that, but in terms of public opinion, I couldn't agree more with Kim. The idea that we're going to allow people to serve in the armed forces but not own guns privately, I really don't think is going to wash with most voters in most places. Where I do think there is probably the most wiggle room, both legally and in popular opinion, is basically with restrictions that make sure that people who are specifically at the most risk have a harder time buying weapons. And the most common ways to do that are through the red flag laws that you mentioned, which basically allow family members, friends, associates of a dangerous person to make a case to a judge that that person can temporarily have their firearms taken from them or could be blocked from acquiring new ones. And we already see those in place in some states, and they're just kind of ramping up enforcement as more people realize that they have that avenue. The other policy would be a tightening background checks. Very famously, the federal law really only requires licensed gun dealers to do, I believe, a full and most thorough form of the background checks. And then states vary in the degree to which they require other unlicensed dealers to do similar background checks. I think that's probably one of the things that's being negotiated in Congress right now, debating whether it would be possible to have a policy that would require more types of sales to pass through a background check process. And I think that depending on the specific terms of that policy, that's something where you could find bipartisan uptake.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street Journal.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. One more thing that President Biden proposed in his speech on Thursday. He said, I believe we should have safe storage laws and personal liability for not locking up your gun. The shooter in Sandy Hook came from a home full of guns. They were too easy to access. That's how he got the weapons, unquote. Kim, what do you make of this? Are there some states that have these kind of laws, and how do they work?
Yeah, there are states that have these kind of laws, and they vary. Some of them simply say that you are required to lock your gun in a secure place, such as a gun safe or a gun cabinet. Some say you have to have trigger or cable locks when they're not in use. Some states require, or there are at least proposals, that any gun that is sold must be sold with a trigger lock. Although, by the way, I can tell you many gun owners just throw those trigger locks away when they come with the thing. The reality is here, though, that if you're in the gun owning community, and I am, gun owners, because they are law-abiding citizens, because they cringe at the notion that someone might come and steal a gun from them, i.e. for a bad guy would have it, because they understand about minors in the homes, etc. They're very, very responsible already about storing their guns. You know, I was actually looking at a little piece on the Giffords Law Center, which is obviously an anti-gun outfit. And they were saying, oh my gosh, nearly a quarter of all gun owners were storing all of their guns in an unlocked location in the home. Okay, that means 3/4 of people already are doing so, which would probably be about the number that I would expect. I think the bigger question here is, and it's unclear yet exactly where the House is going with this. This was one of the proposals they were debating this week, is some sort of safe storage rules, is how are you going to enforce that? Okay. I mean, in a place like New York, when you're trying to get a license for a gun, which is already exceptionally hard to do, I believe that there's some sort of circumstance, and don't quote me exactly, but I believe the police actually have to come and check out your storage facility, etc. But that's as part of the process of getting a permit. How are you going to do that in states where you don't have to have a permit to carry a gun? Are police just going to come conduct random checks in people's houses to look at how they're, and how are they going to guarantee that, by the way, the gun that is stored in a safe one day doesn't come out the next day and isn't stored properly? I mean, daily checks. So I appreciate, well, maybe you say the force of law will inspire people to change their behavior, but this would be a pretty difficult one to actually make sure was happening.
And the sad reality is that the laws that are currently on the books regarding firearms seem like they are not being enforced as it is. And there's a Government Accountability Office report from 2018 that looks at federal background checks. And it says that federal background checks resulted in about 112,000 denied transactions, meaning people who were denied the ability to buy a gun, in fiscal year 2017, of which the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives referred about 12,700 to its field divisions for further investigation. U.S. attorneys' offices had prosecuted 12 of these cases as of June 2018. So just to redo those numbers, there were 112,000 failures of background checks. 12,000 of them were referred for investigation, and 12 of them were prosecuted as of this report. And Monet, in some cases, I think that's because the people who are failing background checks, in some cases, are sympathetic. If they're straw buyers, they may be the mother or the girlfriend or the wife of the person that they are buying the gun for, even though you're not supposed to be allowed to buy a gun for someone. And lying on these background checks, I believe, is punishable by up to 10 years in prison. And the people who are saying that we need new gun laws and we need to enforce these gun laws, it seems, are also the people who would be very upset and would be talking about mass incarceration if we started discussing whether to investigate seriously those 112,000 failed background checks and putting those people into prison for significant amounts of time. And so that's not to say that there is nothing Congress can do to improve the laws around firearms, but it is to point out that the laws that we currently have do not seem like they're being enforced.
Well, you make a fair point about the background checks and the lack of prosecution for people who fail them. I would point out that I'm actually kind of glad to see that the background check system is working somewhat and that number of people being denied. I think that's something that's an open question to a lot of people, sort of how rigorous are these checks and are they actually catching and flagging people who should not be allowed to purchase guns? So we can say that off the bat. It's a good thing that some of these people who are applying are being denied the ability to buy in accordance with what the law is supposed to do. Of course, we don't know how many people are falling through the cracks. But certainly it wouldn't hurt to, on the back end of those failed transactions, have prosecutions taking place, because that would discourage more people who are flagged from attempting to buy these sorts of guns. But to your broader point, yeah, I think it's obvious, and nobody really would disagree, that if we have laws on the books which should have the impact of preventing guns from getting into the wrong hands, we should focus on getting those enforced more before we add new restrictions to the books, which are going to have the impact in many cases of merely burdening the most law-abiding potential gun purchasers. And that makes me think again of red flag laws, which are not necessarily a totally new phenomenon, but which have been expanded a lot over the past few years. I think it was after the Sandy Hook shooting that a lot of states passed them for the first time. And so you have them sitting on the books in a lot of places, but I think there are probably a lot of people who don't realize that they have that avenue to potentially prevent a person who is mentally troubled or a person who is tangled up in crime or other things like that from purchasing a gun. And so that's one thing that leaders should at least be doing in concurrence with debating future gun legislation, making sure that they're properly advertising the laws that already exist and taking advantage of those before we add new restrictions.
Kim, what's your read of the negotiations that are going on in the Senate? Republican leader Mitch McConnell has asked Texas Senator John Cornyn to be the Republican emissary to this bipartisan group, and he is sounding like he wants to get something done. Here's what he recently told Politico. If they didn't get something done, quote, "it would be embarrassing. It would feed the narrative that we can't get things done in the public interest. I don't believe that narrative. I believe we can get a bipartisan deal done in the public interest," unquote. And so, Kim, where do you think these are going? And are there any areas where you might see Republicans and Democrats get together to pass a bill?
I was really surprised, actually, by the president's speech because it was so divorced from where the discussion, in fact, is in the Senate. And it just shocked me a little bit, only in that the president is supposedly very frustrated. This is some of the recent press reports say this, that he's getting blamed for not getting anything done. Well, if you want to get something done, why don't you get on board with the effort that is ongoing, as you just described in the Senate, to actually pass something that might actually help and that both sides have common ground on. And where that is right now in the Senate is really three areas. One is an expansion to some degree of background checks. And of course, the discussion there is going to be just how big of an expansion is that. Then school safety, obviously that is an enormous priority. It's shocking still that what happened in Uvalde, the police were standing outside for an hour as this was going on. I mean, we need to have a better discussion in the country about how we harden to a certain degree some of these schools and et cetera. And then, of course, a discussion about red flag laws. And Monet mentioned those. I think the discussions there are a little tougher because while a lot of people say, yeah, red flag laws, definitely we want to make sure that we are ensuring that people should not be in possession of guns, don't have access to them if they're mentally unwell. But of course, not all red flag laws are the same. And something that I think conservatives will care very much in going about a sort of model federal red flag law. By the way, that's kind of what they're discussing there, is whether or not you could have a red flag law that could be imposed via federal court. They obviously can't impose them on the states, although they could give some grant money for them. But the way that you want to have these laws definitely also wants to be cognizant of civil liberties. For instance, one of the frustrations, I think, from some conservatives in the Senate are proposals that would allow initial orders to be imposed by a judge in an ex parte proceedings, which means without notice to the affected person. thereby not giving he or she any opportunity to actually attend and to contest the allegations, to sort of protect against, for instance, a former spouse who might just not like you and so sort of report you in a way that could get you on a list even though you didn't deserve it. So there does have to be a balance there. Those are the discussions that are going on. I think there's a possibility something could actually get done. It's certainly a lot more likely than the package of bills that are being negotiated in the House right now and teed up for a vote next week that include a lot of President Biden's proposals. They may get the votes firm in the House, but they're dead letter in the Senate.
Thank you, Kim and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.